2, atheists have no morals. One of the most persistent myths is that atheists have no moral compass. Truth is, morality doesn't require religion, and oftentimes is better without it. But atheists can and do follow ethical principles on empathy and social well-being.
While this is most certainly true, as atheists are people just like anyone else, there are atheists who value ethical behaviors and those who do not. However, unlike theists, atheists do not have any God to guide their morality, and thus simply have to use some other form of moral theory, many times not even realizing that they are doing so. Some atheists will naturally follow more of a consequentialist type approach, where the morally permissible act is the one that leads to less harm. The canonical example is, do you lie to save a group of Jews in your basement during World War II? While Kant would have taken a more categorical and absolute view that argued lying is always impermissible, philosophers like Ross, a Scottish Aristotelian philosopher, would have argued for value pluralism, and that sometimes it would be permissible to lie if it led to a greater good. Atheists could argue that we all have some type of prima facie duty when making our moral decisions. Atheists would be constrained by those moral duties, such as fidelity to keep our promises, make reparations to perceived wrongs, and being kind and charitable to others, that many Christians often espouse as being moral.
And do follow ethical principles on empathy and social well-being.
Okay, so I want to point out that she's using language like many people or some people or I've certainly known people and things like that, rather than speaking in generalizations.
I'm pretty sure phrases like many people or some people are forms of generalizations, but just wanted to check with GPT chat just to make sure it agreed with me or not. It does.
People, and a lot of people say that. A lot of people think that atheists, and some people even say that atheists, some people who are not religious might actually enjoy life even more. I've also heard people say that I also can't even begin to tell you how many lives have been dimmed by religion.
And I understand why someone would do that, but it makes it a little bit difficult because the truth is there are people in almost any group who might say almost any old thing.
People could do that, but that's just people making up.
But what most people are talking about when they're talking about morality with you and as it relates to atheism or theism is they're basically saying that it's not that atheists can't act morally. I mean, look, let me help you out here. The truth is all you have to do is find one atheist who has contributed to some actually good charity or helped one little old lady across the street. And guess what? You've got an atheist acting morally. So yes, of course, atheists can act morally. And of course, theists, and of course, Christians can act immorally.
An atheist doing a good deed may be considered a morally permissible act given specific circumstances. It is a form of supererogatory, which is good, but not something an atheist has any obligation or duty to do so. For example, helping an old woman across the street is a moral good, but it isn't wrong deontologically if one fails to do so, as there is no moral obligation to do every single possible kind act that we encounter every day.
This is just the state of affairs. The question is, when you are acting morally, why is that moral? What is the foundation for that? What supports that? What explains all of that? How do we understand all of those things? What we're saying is that you don't have any moral foundation for those things. That's what most Christians or most theists are trying to say about this.
Moral foundations are based upon moral theories, and there are even theories about moral foundations, such as Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory, which is very much in line with a very common moral grounding of eudaimonia, which means human flourishing, or basically harms and benefits to society. An atheist, for example, could objectively argue that we have moral obligations to raise our young for evolutionary purposes to ensure the propagation of the species. It would be an objective truth that if no one ever provided for our children and no child went on to survive, that our species would indeed die out. This is an objective truth. Thus, for an hypothetical imperative, which is goal-driven rather than Kantian categorically driven, it still provides some type of objective moral framework. However, before the atheist even gets to that step, there's often confusion on the difference between normative ethics, which are acts that are morally permissible, and what is morally impermissible, and if moral statements can even be something that is true or false. For example, the moral proposition stealing is wrong to a moral cognitivist would be a proposition that is either true or false. But to a moral non-cognitivist, such moral statements are not truth apt, and the beliefs about such moral statements reflect more of a non-propositional attitude towards the statement.
Now, there may be other, you could be some kind of a non-natural moral realist. You could have some sort of Platonic ideas about morality.
Non-natural moral realism are a priori theories, meaning they are known deductively without having to be observed or experienced, and would be along the lines of G.E. Moore's intuitionism, which focuses more on goodness rather than rightness, or basically what is good rather than what is right or wrong. More believe morality is more of an intrinsic property of mankind, and in general, mankind has some sense of innate intuition of what is a good and what is a bad action, and some things we just learn instinctively as children. Another type of non-natural moral theory would be Kantian ethics, where there are just certain universal principles that exist that we can know by use of reason. This is contrasted with natural moral realism, which is a posteriori knowledge that we can know from observation or experience, championed by Aristotle, Aquinas, Hume, Locke, Dewey, Hobbes. Well, you get the point. Other forms would be utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism that what is moral is what produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Or virtue ethics, an arete theory where morality is based upon character rather than consequences, or deontic theories which appeal to moral obligations or duties.
I'm just saying that in this paradigm, when people are talking about atheist immorality, they're not saying you can't be moral. Maybe you've met some people or certain people that are that way. But really what they're saying is you have no ultimate foundation. If you've kind of fabricated your morality or gone with the morality that originates in your own mind or based on what you think the culture approves of or that sort of thing, then what you've done is you've constructed like a moral bubble for that group of people to live within.
Moral relativism is the philosophical theory that holds that what makes something moral or immoral is relative to something like culture, called cultural relativism, or relative to some historical time period, called historical relativism, and denies the existence of any absolute morals, as absolutism holds there are moral truths that are always impermissible, regardless of circumstances.
For example, a moral relativist could argue that slavery wasn't morally wrong historically because it was allowed by some culture or historical time period, and perhaps they just didn't know that slavery itself was wrong, so they were not being immoral by having slaves. But to a moral absolutist or a moral universalist, they would argue that slavery was still wrong, even in the past, regardless of whether they had the moral knowledge or not of it being morally impermissible.
But if you think it's wrong, for example, or that people shouldn't, let's say, do acts of kindness.
Again, acts of kindness are supererogatory, morally permissible acts, not obligatory. However, if one argued one should not do good acts, or even be forbidden to do so, it would be in the form of anti-supererogatoryism, which does exist, such as the idea that duty-based ethics only allow us to do what we are obliged to do, and doing above those acts could lead to harm to society, such as giving away free homes to everyone would devalue existing real estate owned by homeowners.
Prevent people from gender transition, let's say, or people shouldn't steal, kill, or hurt other people. If you want to say, or people shouldn't think of abortion as a bad thing, they should think of it as a woman's choice. When you want to start taking these shoulds and shouldn'ts that are important to you, I'm imagining, within your moral sphere, you got to understand that if there's not some overarching moral sphere, if there's not some ultimate morality, some objective morality, I might call it actual morality, that hangs over all of that.
According to divine command theory, there exists some independent, all-knowing observer that knows all morally permissible and impermissible acts, and following that observer's commandments would be morally good. The problem with this view is that this type of moral theory is known as moral or ethical subjectivism, because it is based upon the views of the observer and not objectively able to be discovered by individuals. The divine command theorists must basically have faith, so to speak, that they are in fact in communication with this independent moral observer, that the moral observer is giving them the correct moral facts to make more normative decisions, and more importantly, that they are correctly comprehending these moral commandments.
Then you can hold people accountable in your moral sphere if they agree with you. But if there's another moral sphere of people over here that don't agree with you about those things, you have no basis from this moral sphere to say to those people in that moral sphere, you should or shouldn't do X, Y, and Z, because you're just talking about your own fabricated morality. What about their fabricated morality that's based on their thinking, their context, their position, and who says they have to care about what you care about in this regard?
Individualism is the philosophical theory that moral judgments are merely based upon an individual's personal views on morality, but an atheist can certainly adopt a more objective framework for morality, where individual views on morality become irrelevant, as it wouldn't be a matter of who cares about what. Humans have developed moral theories in order for human beings to coexist with other humans in a collective society. For a moral objectivist, aka moral realist, that holds there are moral facts and that some of those moral facts are objectively true, that if something objectively causes harm, it is immoral. Torturing someone for fun would be objectively immoral, and if some disagree, it'd be merely similar to someone disagreeing that 1 + 1 = 2. It wouldn't matter to the moral objectivist if indeed torturing for fun caused harm to someone, as there's an objective fact of the matter to be had, which is the harm being done to the person being tortured. To hold someone accountable for an impermissible act is to appeal to a moral theory which may or may not have intersubjective agreement. Of course, when discussing moral objectivism, someone almost inevitably says something like, but what if you wanted to base morality on inflicting the most harm as some type of maleficent moral theory, one that promotes evil and immoral acts? Then that would be fundamentally changing the entire reason for which humans develop moral theories in the first place.
Okay, well, now we're talking about something completely different. The reality is that if you're going to say that there's not an ultimate objective morality, then the idea comes that that's really, you're just kind of, now we're just talking about in your moral sphere what you like and what you don't like versus what somebody else likes or doesn't like, and you call that morality. But understand that the way we talk about that is that's just kind of your fabricated morality based on subjective goals, ultimately.
When morality is based upon non-propositional attitudes, as with moral non-cognitivism, while the goals are arbitrary, it doesn't mean necessarily that they are subjective. An arbitrary goal would be something like, I have a goal to go on a diet and lose weight. However, what it means for me to meet that goal is subjective to me and me alone. No person can look at me and say, I have met my goal objectively, as my goal is not independently discoverable as some mind-independent objective fact of reality. So do atheists need a God to be just as moral as a theist? Absolutely not. And both the atheist and the theist have the same epistemic limitations and epistemic fallibilities as each other. And humans didn't develop moral theories to apprehend the desires of a God, but to simply coexist with each other, regardless of whether God exists or not.